And good evening. It's April 11th, 2024, and welcome to another edition of Coffee and Donuts. Many of the folks that I know, they often hear me say, here's something to ponder, something to think about. We'll probably need coffee and donuts to chat about it. Because these podcasts are normally intended to be short, so it might be a little long, but it's with the idea to have you chew on the thought amongst yourselves. C&D at the ready. So, welcome to another Coffee and Donuts on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, you think these might be useful to others, it's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. Translation? What's the best translation? This episode is inspired from an article that Skip had posted. It's called Translation. Perhaps this is one of the most frequent questions asked. Because in the past, I've often replied, every translation has its difficulties. Just be aware of them and choose the one that brings you nearest to God. Might be a mistake, because translation itself might be a mistake. Well, more of a challenge, really. Because translation, it's the claim of any Bible except the one in the original language, yes? But unfortunately, the word itself contains the mistaken idea that translation conveys the same meaning as the original. I love musical analogies. It gives me personally such a vivid thing to grasp. So, when the violin repeats what the piano has just played, it cannot make the same sounds. It can only approximate the same chords. It can, however, make recognizably the same music, right? The same air. But it can do so only when it's faithful to the self-logic of the violin, right? As it works as to the self-logic of the piano. Because language, too, it's an instrument, and each language has its own logic. And I believe that the process of rendering from language to language is better conceived as a transposition rather than a translation. Because translation implies, to be fair, it's a series of word-for-word equivalencies that do not exist across language boundaries, as more about a piano that exists in sound with the violin. The notion of word-for-word equivalence also has a problem because it always strikes me as challenging in the nature of poetry. Yes? Because poetry is not made up of words, but of word complexes, elaborate structures involving, amongst other things, detonations, contonations, rhythms, puns, juxtapositions, and echoes of the tradition of which the poet is writing. It's difficult enough in prose, and it's almost impossible in poetry to juggle such complex lines interact across a barrier of language, especially from language to language. If Chiardi is correct, and I'm fairly sure he is, then reliance on a translation would be the equivalent of listening to, say, Beethoven's Ninth on a synthesizer. Because the purpose of translation is not to represent what the Bible says in its native tongue. It is to communicate a theological message. If you want to know what God said to the Israelites, that's when you learn their language. But if you're only interested in communicating what you think the proper theological outcome should be, that's when you translate. So please, don't pretend that our translation is an exact copy of the original, right? Violin is not a piano. Soul is not nefesh. You use a translation because it's easier. But in the process, you can deny yourself the opportunity to hear the full symphony, to appreciate the intertwined poetry, to revel in the depths of the words. You just settle for what you believe is true. The reinforcement of your preconceived ideas about God and its instructions, however those preconceived ideas were learned, that's what we keep. Okay, so now all that out on the table. Now let's talk. Because context is important here on the Dusty Feet, and we're talking about the idea of original language versus translation and our expectations from those texts. I've said this before. My wife and I, we love to watch foreign shows. We like murder mysteries and all that kind of stuff. So we watch foreign shows and we listen to them in the original language. Then we read the subtitles so that we have a better idea of what we're looking at here. So this is an easy, direct example of original language. It gets a little twisted, though, because it's actually being heard, which is a little bit different concept. Because the original language is heard, you're just reading the text underneath. But if you've done this at all yourselves, it's interesting, especially the more you get into languages and where you recognize words, whether it's French or Italian or Swedish or Spanish or pick a language. Soon you're going to recognize words that they're speaking, and then you realize the text underneath, it's not exactly what they said. And then sometimes it's easy to deal with that sometimes with language sentence structure, right? Because you're going to hear them speak and you're going to hear adjectives after nouns or verbs and adverbs flipped and those kind of things. Because sentence structure is different. I get that. But the second part, because sometimes the words are not the words that we're reading in English, might not exactly the ones you're hearing on the screen. Because what they try to do with the translation was trying to give some understanding of the English that's going on, but it's not a word-for-word context phrase. They're not speaking a word and then you're getting those exact texts underneath in the subtitles. So we're already understanding in a movie or a TV that it's necessary, but maybe we fail to consider this when it comes to our own scriptures. Another thing that we really enjoy when we're listening or hearing originals, we like these much better, or at least I do, than the overdubbed voice versions, right? Because I want to hear the emotion that comes from those original actors. They're in a scene, and then I see if there's tears in their eyes, the timing of the words that come out, the emotion, the hesitation, body language. All those are effective parts of communication. I want to take a little step back. I want to look at the original text, which is kind of funny. The original language was actually Paleo-Hebrew. Go look it up. It's a series of characters that today would probably actually remind us more of emoticons. Okay? But these were there for the storyteller to read, to guide them through the story. We'll get more on that later. But suffice to be aware that even in the original language, folks were not reading the original text, at least in mass. They heard the text told, not read. It's more like a scene from a movie. As in the people, average Joe Blow, it took millennia before people would even come near to having their own copy of this text. I mean, many millennium. So it was a storyteller telling the story in the original language. Okay, so we'll fast forward a little bit. This is fun. We're going to address storytelling. Remember why I said that I like to listen to the original language and then read the subtitles? Because I enjoyed the emotions, the tones, the body language of the actors. And in this example, I'm going to use the word storyteller. As we're aware, some storytellers, better storytellers than others, in dubbed acting for the majority of the experiences, for me anyways, it's more about reciting the text at the same timing as the lips moving, but missing at times the human element. See a old Godzilla movie, for example of that. But all of the early followers of God, both in the Tanakh and the Brit, right, that Old and New Testaments, they were told the stories by storytellers. They did not each get to read it. They all had to hear it. Hence Shema. Wait a minute. Does it make you uncomfortable that I called the people that were sharing the Bible storytellers? As I started to think of it in that direction, these storytellers telling God's story. So then I wondered if the storytelling got flat, right? That's part of the reason for the drift, was possibly the staleness of the repetition of the story. The passion had crept out. Emotion had drifted. The words, they just became monotone. I mean, picture a time when the people that were there telling the story, sharing Psalms or Proverbs, you're listening to the teller pleading out the anguish of David, his groaning in Psalm 22. So it'd be weird if someone back then in the storyteller era had heard it but told in a monotone cadence. For them, it'd be almost unnerving. Okay, so I have a tool that I use at times, and this will probably divide the room just saying it, so here it goes. Sometimes I use an AI tool for voice work. It is kind of fun. I use it to read text for me, and I'm actually having fun with some ideas with AI voices, accents, different things. It's fun. But when you listen, especially with the original AI voices, they were very boxy, right? They could read the text. It was very cool to give you a voice from the text that you fed in. And then they tried to add a little inflection, just no depth to it. Even with good ones, you're not going to convey everything, because the difference between an audiobook and a scene from a book is also, it's in the mind. It's in the body language of the storyteller. It's conveyed through tone. Take a step back. Where the original storytellers were telling the story in the original language to the original audience, because they were feeling all of that. Voice, face, body. Okay, but now what we tend to do, we just pick up our Bibles. We start to read. But I think when we read them, I think we've done ourselves a disservice at times, because I think, just Bob's opinion on the Dusty Feet, I just think at times when we read it monotone. We don't grasp that emotion, that depth. I think we really don't understand the times that they're in, the context that we're reading about, the people behind it, the scene behind what's going on in the story. We're not combining all of that to ourselves in our heads. If I were to read us a story to you and try and convey that part, then maybe a little idea what I'm talking about here. So let me see. This is from a monologue by an actress named Mia Haw. It's only a minute. Here's the text. You don't know. You don't know what it's like. You walked out of my life that day I was born. You gave me up. So don't stand there and act like you care about me, because you didn't. How could you say you loved me when you gave me away? I hate you. I wish you were dead. I wish you were I never found you. You're never going to be my mother. So just give up. Okay, so there's a little emotion there. Maybe a bit conveyed. But here is the scene as it was designed.
You don't know. You know what it's like. You walked out of my life the day I was born. You gave me up. So don't stand there and act like you cared about me, because you didn't. How could you say you love me when you gave me away? I hate you. I wish you were dead, and I wish I never found you. You're never going to be my mother, so just give up. Scene.
Okay, so how was that? I mean, you had the first time that I said it and I just read the text. I added a little bit there. There was still something. All the same words are there. But then you saw or heard the second one. And also an interesting thought in that I was a male reading it first, and yet the scene there was designed for a female to play. And I think the Psalms especially fall prey to this monotone, this lack of depth. At least it suffers more than most texts. I mean, read David again in Psalms 22 in the same light as the scene you just saw, if you can, because I think it's going to give greater depth. Again, it's the mode of the storyteller. So that's just hopefully just a smidgen, just a thought of what we lose, not only in translation, but in expression. Because I think we forget that the words that were captured are often not just a rote account, that they're part of an expression. They're part of a painting of a picture. The author is presenting something to us. And I believe we tend to lose expression, we lose creativity in translation. Because I think sometimes we think at times we're in a better place. And I guess for the most part, being able to look at Scripture the way we do is nice. Yet we lose a storytelling when we just started reading the text. We took a part of the human element out of the human sharing. Like I said, the facial expressions, the body language, we took all of that away when the storyteller disappeared. I think that's sad. Because me personally, I enjoy a wonderful storyteller. I've had the privilege of meeting someone that I would call a true storyteller, Dr. Sakina. He's a native Alaskan Indian, and he loves to tell stories. He is a remarkable storyteller. And when I was with him, and I'm hearing him tell his stories, I can see the scene almost like it was from a motion picture. You know, when I'm there and I'm kind of takes me back to a movie scene with a village sitting around a fire at night. People at the end of the day, the hunter-gatherers have returned. The women have prepared and fed the meals to the family. The people settle in to hear the storyteller. There might be more than one. Much is shared here. There's things to learn, history told, lineages remembered. God shared how he has become a part of the people's culture, remembering why we do what we do, why we live the way we live. Because often the deepest stories are shared by the eldest, right? They've experienced so much, but maybe they're scarred, withered, missing limbs from battle or disease, but they remain. To tell the tale has been told to them for so many years and so many years ago. You know, it's not always the tribal chief that tells the tale, because often the tribal chief chapter, his chapter, is being written as he lives for the storyteller to witness and then to share to future generations. You know, this might sound like something out of a Native American Western. It does fit. But it's also the picture of how the scriptures, as we know them, were told or shared for millennium. And in all of that, the language had never changed. It was the story of the original people told to the lineage of the generations after. Just that now, in our time, now we see a change. At least we see it reflected with Jesus. Maybe not so much originally in the way the story was being told, but now the audience was growing. It was going to get bigger. Because now there were people with no depth of history that are suddenly popped into the listener role. At times these new folks, not understanding the story. I love the scene in the Scroll of Acts and the divine hearing aid needed for the new audience. Because times will be changing. This was a challenge even back then. Folks with no history are thrust into the story. They might not appreciate the need to keep the story straight, to share the full story from the beginning, the same way that had been passed down to so many generations before. To appreciate the tales before they were thrust in, to take the time to embrace the tale, to experience the tale. I think that's very much the mindset of the Torah being read every single year. End a year, start again, to learn the tale better, to remember the tale better, to embrace the tale more fully, and remembering all along that there will always be new ones to hear the tale. So those stories, gathered first in Paleo-Hebrew emoticons to help the storyteller remember the tale. From there, that grew into letters, jots and tittles, text, books, chapters, verses. Now we have our leather-bound tomes. But maybe in gathering them in this manner, maybe we lost just a little bit. Because before that, we had the storyteller. Now we have the text. Honestly, do think we missed a bit. Because now the audience, they don't understand the stories told around the fire. Someone has to figure out how to share this story with them. It's hard. It's near impossible to capture all of that, to convert all of that into any other language, especially one that's not tied to the story itself. Language structures are different. Words are different. Even easy ones like love. Greek, there are 4 words. English, 1. We need to add words around the word to convey one word in another language. That's just the descriptive, right? We don't even talk about the full emotion behind the word. You get the point. So yes, in a sense, I will still say every translation has its difficulties. Just be aware of them. Choose the one that brings you nearest to God. Just yet now be aware and understand that there's more to the story. I want to pause here for a minute and remind us that for the majority of the people looking at us, if you're watching this, you're listening to it in English, unless you're using those cool subtitle pieces, but we're only addressing English with our examples, right? But what about in Japanese or in Thai or in Hindi or fill in a language? Because what I want us to remember in all of this is to be very careful. Because I think it's part of the point to stake one's theological position on only an English translation. Well, there might be more translations to consider. Because there's many more people around this world than just us English-speaking folk. Is that easy? No, not at all. It's challenging. And one of the amazing parts about being alive today is that, I could pick up a book or go online and see the original text with the language of choice alongside. For me, it just happens to be English. But I don't have any real meaningful history with that language, with those people, and those ancient stories told. So I lean heavily on academic like Skip Moen or our work with Rabbi Foreman at Aleph Beta. because we're new to the story. We need to find our place. So I do tend to be more lenient with the academics that work so hard to translate, the folks that are trying to understand. Because we're at a loss from the start. We never got to enjoy the fullness of Scripture in the person of the storyteller. You know, if I were a betting man, I'd wager that Jesus, right, Yeshua, he was a master storyteller, reminding them of the connections to the stories in the past, the changes that are coming, parables to cause us to pay closer attention to the storyteller, and all the stories that connected to the storytellers of old. I hope that my part in another storyteller's tale, that it will not be flat, monotone, that it won't be hieroglyphic or emoticon free, right? I hope it's going to be one told with emotion, with passion. Maybe one like a parable, left asking questions. Pick a translation. For the record, I use NASB. That's my favorite version of choice, but pick one. Read it. Try it. Hear it. If you have an Audible Bible, enjoy it. But maybe you'll recognize or you'll realize that it might lack the storyteller's engagement. But it's going to help. Heck, you can get through a 1611 version of King James. Have at it. I know way too many folks that can't even get through a Shakespeare play. Lost in translation. So, translation? Choose. Just be aware that there really is, as Paul Harvey used to so eloquently state.
Now you know the rest of the story.
And thanks for with us tonight on another Coffee and Donuts episode on the Dusty Feet.